Good morning, good morning to you. You. Good morning, good morning
November.
to you. You. Good morning, good morning. Won't you share with a friend or two? Good morning, good morning to you. You. Good morning, good morning, good morning to you. You. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Good morning to you. Good morning to you. And many more. Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome, welcome, welcome. I do apologize for getting here a minute late. I want to welcome you back to Daring Dialogues. I'm your host today, Shantae Charles. Again, I hope that you've been having a great and wonderful day. In the light of everything that's been happening in the world, I have been excited because I have been making some art. And so, and I have, my mind again has been fueled to make some art. So I got up this morning and wrote down my reflection on November 5th by poem. And that poem is now posted on my TikTok, and it's also posted on my Black Table Talk Facebook page. You can check it out. I posted it as a reel as I read it aloud, called November 5th. It is Thinking Thursday here, so we are hopping back into our Thinking Thursday topic. If you want to know what I thought about the election or my thoughts on the election, you can check yesterday's broadcast, where we went into a little bit of overtime talking about some of the issues in the election, data points, our thoughts about the people who are going to be leading in the next 4 years. And I don't know if I would even call it leading. Um, it'll be something. I don't know if it's going to be leadership. So just buckle up, get your mind ready, wrap your head around the notions, all of those things, as we would say. But today we are back in Theology Thursday, Thinking Thursday, where we focus on points of faith, points of belief, philosophy, all that good stuff. If you travel back into our playlist on YouTube, you will see where we have done, we've looked into some philosophy, we've looked into world religions, world faiths, all of that. But in this particular book, we are actually digging into the idea and the notion of forgiveness. And I'm excited to see so many people now that are starting to dive a little bit more into the subject of forgiveness, um, examine their own ideas around forgiveness. What does it actually mean to forgive? Examine the context around forgiveness and not just simply go with a blanket uh, statement that we should all forgive, right? So the book that we're looking at is called Failures of Forgiveness, What We Get Wrong, because I think that's super important, and How to Do Better. Notice she didn't say what we get wrong and how to do it right. She said what we get wrong and how to do better. And I love that. That is the premise of this book. Now we're heading into chapter 5, which is When Race Matters. And she's getting ready to talk about some of the police shootings that have occurred. One of them that she starts off with, I think for me, really kind of began my trajectory into um, sort of more so diving in a more personal way into understanding what was happening around police brutality. Now, I had witnessed some things, of course, in my childhood, but I remember where I was um, when the Trayvon Martin incident happened. I remember that I was an educator. I remember the school I was in at the time. I remember um, even when the verdict and everything came out about it, I remember the deep, deep sadness that came over people that I was around. I remember, and I can still sort of feel that feeling of dread and despair. If I take myself back to that place, that feeling of dread and despair was tangible where I was at the time. I remember being in a community at the time where I was what they call a super minority, where less than 7% of the entire population was Black or other. That was everybody combined, the 7%. And so I remember being at the school that I was working at that time was the last school in the nation to integrate. Yeah, it was the last school in the nation to integrate. And many of the educators that worked at that school had been there for 50 years when I was there. So some of the educators that were at that school still held Jim Crow-ish attitudes and behaviors, and they lived through and taught through integration. But this school was the last school that integrated in the nation because of how they felt about Black people. And some of those people were still on staff teaching Black children. Just wrap your head around that. And so when this verdict and everything came out, when the telephone calls and things like that were being put out into the public, it was very difficult to go into a space where the people in that space didn't necessarily feel any empathy or feel any compassion towards what was happening in the Black community at large and how we were feeling. They didn't do anything for the students at that time, and they certainly didn't do anything for the staff at that time. At that time, I think there was maybe 3 or 4 of us on staff that were African American in terms of educators. And so it was a very depressing time. It was a very isolating time. There wasn't someone that you could just go and have a conversation with about what had happened. And when you went to into the school space, nobody was talking about it. Nobody was having a conversation about it. They weren't trying to address our students and how the students felt about what was going on. If you remember, this was a teenage boy. And so the Black boys in that school, nobody was having a conversation with them about what happened. And the conversations that I did try to have, I was quickly told, we don't need to be talking about that. We don't need to be talking about that in this space. So it was a very, very isolating and traumatic time. It was. Um, I know that from my end, I speak as an educator. Um, not being able to really voice how I felt at that time was traumatic. And so trauma, as we know, lives and it can live in the body. Um, and so I do the work myself personally to try to go back to those times when I was feeling a certain way about things and really get that out of my system and express myself, because I still have memories about how my school, how my community, how my county at the time responded to something that was happening and triggering the nation at the time. All right. So that's going to be the premise by which I read this today, because reading about these things is triggering. Um, if you have sensitivity around that, I want to just encourage you to, if you need to step away or you need to pause and come back, you can do that. But here we go. When race matters. On February 26, 2012, George Zimmerman, a neighborhood watch volunteer, shot and unalived 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in what many believe was a case of racial profiling. After the acquittal of Zimmerman, a BBC reporter asked Martin's parents if they could ever find it in themselves to forgive Zimmerman. Sabrina Martin replied, "As Christians, we have to forgive, but it's a process, and we are still going through that healing process." On July 19, 2015, Samuel DuBose, a black man, was shot in the head by a white police officer in Cincinnati, Ohio. A couple of days after his death, a reporter asked his mother, Audrey DuBose, "You're obviously a person of faith. Do you see it in your heart to forgive this person, this officer, whether he's convicted or not?" She replied, "If he asked for forgiveness, oh yeah, I can forgive anybody. God forgave us." On July 17th, 2014, Eric Garner was killed by New York City police officers after being approached for selling single cigarettes on the street. After the grand jury failed to indict the officers involved, reporters asked his wife, Esau Garner, can the family have it in their heart to accept the officer's apology? An officer offered an apology and made it available to media outlets. Mrs. Garner responded, "He double hockey sticks, no. Time for remorse would have been when my husband was yelling to breathe." As these three cases illustrate, racial violence in the United States is frequently followed by a public request for forgiveness. Now I want to ask the question. I've never, if you have, please send me the link. If you have ever seen somebody on national TV put a microphone in the face of a white person and a white family members and ask them, can you find it in your heart to forgive? I've never seen it. If you've seen it, please send me the link. Put the link inside of my comments on YouTube when this video airs. Okay, it won't save it in the live comments. But if you've ever seen that, I want a link, because I've never seen it. I've never seen that done to a white family or a white person who has experienced some sort of injustice, and a microphone is put in their face saying, can you find it in your heart to forgive? If you've seen it, send me a link, because I haven't seen it. I haven't. Now let me continue. And good morning to those of you who are coming in, and good morning to our new subscribers. All of these cases illustrate racial violence in the United States is frequently followed by a public request for forgiveness. This is partly explained by the fact that racial harms have a broader socio-political impact, and forgiveness is seen as one way to repair the wound that has been inflicted. But how are we repairing wounds when there is no justice? How are we repairing wounds when we're skipping due process? Yet, she says, as I argue in this chapter, when requesting goes public, it often goes horribly wrong. These forgiveness requests represent what I refer to as the hurry and bury ritual. Somebody type that in our comments. The hurry and bury ritual. The public practice of quickly asking victims, particularly women and non-whites, to forgive in ways that can implicitly or explicitly communicate disrespect and obscure wrongdoing. While this ritual can manifest in different contexts, I will focus primarily on examples dealing with race, paying close attention to its familiar appearance in cases of police brutality against blacks and racial violence in the United States. By clarifying what is morally worrisome about this ritual, we can formulate more appropriate and fruitful questions to ask victims of wrongdoing in public settings. Hurry and bury. There are three features of the hurry and bury ritual that can disrespect others and get in the way of repair. The first, quickness, is the most obvious feature. To refer to requests as quick may present an immediate worry because quick seems subjective. When it comes to our emotional states, what is quick for some may not be quick for others. For instance, I may be able to move on from a relationship within 6 months, whereas others, for example, may judge it as too quick. I describe forgiveness requests as quick if we make them before certain psychological, ritualistic, and legal markers are present. The appropriate psychological markers are relative to the makeup of the individual. They are particular markers in the mourning or healing process, such as the lessening or absence of grief or shock. You know, like how the nation right now, a lot of people in this country right now are in mourning for an America that they had hoped for, that for the next 4 years will not be. It is inappropriate to come in people's space and tell them to move on or to get over it when they know that the next 4 years is probably going to shape the next 50 years of American life or longer. That the next 4 years could further gut and take away the rights of citizens, both legal and supposedly illegal people who have come here. And even though I say that no human being is illegal, we know that we have laws and policies in place that say you are unauthorized to be here if you don't meet certain criteria. And so it is rude, it is disrespectful, it is dismissive of people's actual souls when you try to rush them along from a grief process. So we try not to do that. We try not to rush people along. Ritualistic markers may include such things as the victim's funeral, but these markers based on rituals may also coincide with moral markers, such as a sincere apology or reparations from the wrongdoer, and the denouncement of the wrongdoing by others. The presence of these psychological and ritualistic markers is important because they are signs that a person may be more prepared or currently in the process of moving forward from the wrongdoing. So, are we asking people to forgive before someone's even had a funeral? Sometimes that is actually being done on national television. Are we asking people to forgive when there has been no denouncement of wrongdoing, when there has been no acknowledgement of wrongdoing? Legal markers, which may include arrests, indictments, or convictions, are often important because they serve as a means of reaching other markers. For through investigations and trials, authorities often make information public that may help the victim move forward. But certain legal markers may also include moral and ritualistic markers. For example, indictments or convictions are public acknowledgments that an injustice has occurred. When Black victims suffer violence from white perpetrators, particularly agents of the state, these legal markers are often absent. Moreover, because Blacks disproportionately suffer hate crimes, they are most frequently put at risk of being solicited for these quick, bury in a hurry requests. In the case previously cited, some psychological, realistic, and legal markers were not met. A reporter, for example, made a forgiveness request to Trayvon Martin's parents 5 months after his death and after an apology offered by Zimmerman, but also before the trial and only just after an indictment. A reporter made a forgiveness request in the case of Samuel Dubose before his family even buried him. In the case of Philando Castile, a black man who was killed by Minnesota police in 2016, a reporter made a forgiveness request only one day after Castile's murder, a day in which the family was surely still grieving and in shock. Whether or not a forgiveness request is too quick will also depend on the broader patterns of social structure. For instance, in the United States context, where there have been recurring acts of police wrongdoing against blacks and little structural response to such violence, there is a good reason to think that requests for forgiveness for acts of police wrongdoing will almost always be too quick. In the presence of ongoing racial injustice, the ritualistic, moral, and legal markers will not be met. However, if these patterns do not exist in another country and all other markers have been met, a forgiveness request might not be quick, all things considered. These quick requests to black victims, no matter what the requester's intentions are, could manifest disrespect by violating what I call the too soon norm. You can type that in. Too soon norm. The phrase too soon is used colloquially as a response to a joke that shouldn't be made, not because it isn't funny, but because the event that the subject of the joke is has happened too recently. When a joke is made too soon, it can show insensitivity to those who were victims of or directly affected by the event. So it's best that the jokester wait longer to tell the joke. When I refer to the too soon norm, I am pointing to a standard concerning timing. I am not suggesting that we should never ask black victims to forgive. I am simply noting that given the tragic weight that accompanies racial violence in our country, one ought to wait longer before making a forgiveness request of a black victim than one would if the victim were white. This is because the black victim is experiencing not only an individual harm, but also a racialized harm that is part of a broader pattern of harms and has a special meaning that marks black people as inferior and vulnerable. To violate the norm is to minimize the harms by not responding to the black person with the consideration they deserve. As a result, these requests show a race-based disrespect to the victim, which is what I alluded to earlier. It is a form of disrespect. Violation of the too soon norm can suggest several things. It may suggest that the requester does not view the harm as racial or race motivated. This may, of course, be the result of the requester's ignorance. The requester might not know how a prevalent racial violence or discrimination is today, or about the disproportionate number of black people who are unalived by the police annually. However ignorant, no matter how linked to innocence it is, can still do harm in the world. It can also be a manifestation of disrespect when the ignorant person shows a lack of effort to understand a black person from his or her point of view. That is, that they experience racialized harms in ways that other groups do not. The violation of the norm may also suggest that the harm is racial, but quote unquote, not that bad. For example, a requester might agree that workplace discrimination, racial profiling, and being the target of microaggressions are instances of racial harms. But because the victim did not die and instead only received results or insults to their dignity or experienced discomfort, the harms are considered not that bad. Since they are not that bad, they are not worth our full consideration. So why wait to ask about forgiveness? This response minimizes racial harms and feelings associated with them, but it also shows a failure to provide proper consideration to the victim. By doing so, we fail to give serious attention to the sufferings of others. This too is an example of disrespect. In addition to being disrespectful, requests for forgiveness that arrive too soon can also impede forgiveness and repair, thereby undermining the requester's efforts. If the requester believes that the racial harm that has occurred is minimal in comparison to what the victim has actually experienced, and they refuse to respond with appropriate empathy, a victim may find it hard to forgive. The work of the psychologist Judy Eaton and colleagues helps illuminate this point. And we're wrapping up for today with our reading. Eaton's research shows that confirming harms rather than minimizing them positively influences victims' willingness to forgive. When we as bystanders sincerely tell victims that we understand what has happened to them, the gravity of the situation, and why they feel the way they do, this can lead them to forgive. As they note in their study, forgiveness was significantly higher when the response included acknowledgement than when it did not. And this is because victims felt perceptionally validated. When victims felt that others understood their view of what happened, they were more willing to forgive. But even if providing validation and confirmation did not make victims more willing to forgive, it would still be valuable for its own sake. So, as we think about this, as we reflect on this notion of the hurry and bury, I want you to ask yourself in your life, have you felt hurried along? Have you felt hurried along? When things have gone on in your life that you have found to be unfair, you found to be unjust, have you felt like someone has tried to hurry you along, to bury it, to sort of minimize the harm that has happened or has been done to you? I want you to think about that. And then I want to encourage you to get this book for yourself so you can start digging into this concept of forgiveness. Um, and I will close by saying this. Don't let anybody hurry you along. Take your time, sit with what has happened, analyze it, lean in, evaluate what has happened. Don't ignore it. Don't brush it off. If you need to talk with a therapist or a counselor, please do that. If you want to journal it and write it out before you even go in to talk to a therapist or a counselor, feel free to do that. But what I want to encourage you to do is to not minimize the things that have happened to you that have been hurtful, that have been harmful, that have been detrimental to your well being. You deserve to be heard. You deserve to go through your process of feeling and your process of healing. I want to thank you for your time and attention today. If you would like to join us for the talk back, we're over on IG Live right now at Daring Dialogues, and you can hear my response and our listeners' response to today's reading. Again, if you're on YouTube, I hope I will see you on tomorrow. Same place, same time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Be well, and most importantly, be light.